Pull up, grab the fuel nozzle, and get ready to fuel up on trends and strategies to grow your travel center business in this episode of the Truck Stops Here, brought to you by NATSO. Now, here's your host, Amy Toner.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Truck Stops Here. I'm your host, Amy Toner. You are listening to the Truck Stops Here, NATSO's podcast. The Truck Stops Here is produced by the NATSO Foundation. The NATSO Foundation is the research, education, and public outreach subsidiary of NATSO. And NATSO is the National Trade Association for Truck Stops. And our mission is to advance the success of truck stops and travel centers. And this podcast is one of the many ways that NATSO and the NATSO Foundation do that. The reality of installing EV chargers is not as easy as just buying and installing chargers. While travel center owners' first thought is to procure chargers, they often overlook how much energy the chargers consume during EV charging, which is why I've invited new NATSO allied member Scale Microgrids onto the podcast to help walk listeners through some of these complex considerations. My guest, Tim Victor, serves as project lead for EV infrastructure at Scale Microgrids. Welcome, Tim.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, great to be here.
Thanks. You know what? Why don't we have you introduce yourself before I launch into all my questions?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Tim Victor. I've been with Scale Microgrids for about 3 years now. Scale's been around for about 6. And I've had quite a different background of jumping around in industries and ultimately ending up here doing some climate work, which is exactly what I really wanted to do.
Awesome. Okay. So as I said in the intro, there's a very complex puzzle of producing the expected energy demand for adding electric vehicle stations. Can you kind of walk us through what those are?
Yeah, definitely. And from Scale's perspective, when we look at these things, we really want to think more from an energy perspective as opposed to, more of the customer interaction perspective. And so what we're really looking at is when we come to a site or when we come to a customer, we're really saying, hey, what existing facility load do you have on site? And what do we think it's going to look like in the future when you add that EV charging piece? There's a couple of different ways of how to really calculate that. But what we do is we kind of take a really simple way of really understanding that, which is going and getting that 8760, which means for every hour of the year, we get essentially an energy value. And we use that in a model to essentially say, this is what it looks like for your entire year of energy consumption. And then what we do is we add on the EV charging piece of that based on essentially some really basic assumptions on assuming commute type of charging, where, during the morning and during the evening is when we'll kind of add in that extra charging load. Mm-hmm. And it's based on the infrastructure that you're planning on putting on that site. So one example is the NEVI requirements, which are the 4x150 kilowatt chargers. We can essentially say, you would expect almost peak demand during the shoulder hours or in the morning or in the evening. And then we kind of blend all these things together and add in a little bit of weather data to really add some of that temperature side of it. And then we kind of come up with a year-long data set that says, traditionally, this is what we would kind of expect as being something that you would see on site.
Okay. So what does that mean for the economics of a travel center adding EV charging?
From an economics perspective, the biggest thing is really the local utility that you're working with. And so currently in every utility, there's actually a couple different tariffs that you can utilize, and tariffs being the energy prices that you're paying per unit of energy. Many of the more progressive utilities have EV specific rates, which essentially are incentivizing charging overnight, and peak pricing tends to be quite higher than normal peak pricing. And all of these things kind of combine with the expected demand, as well as the on-site facility. If you are essentially to the point that you're going to add charging load to an existing facility service, you have the ability to kind of get a little bit more load diversity. But if they're separate, you're essentially you're calculating both of them separately and then combining them for that site. But generally what we see is that the economics for that actual location is highly dependent on what you expect as utilization for that site. And that kind of gets into that further conversation of how do you predict utilization? How do you have a general understanding of that?
Yeah.
And I think right now it's really hard to have an accurate way of measuring it without having prior experience. And so one of the things that we kind of suggest is to get your feet wet and to actually get out there and put some sort of, pilot type of installation in the ground so that you can understand exactly how this is going to work for those sites.
Yeah. I know our members always say they want to have like the right thing at the right time, so it's probably hard to figure out that timing.
Yeah. And to add to that, I mean, one of the benefits right now, because this is a new market, is there's a lot of incentives and subsidies available to actually make it much less of a risky decision to kind of go ahead and move forward with it.
What are your recommendations for economically meeting the demand?
So, the first step is really talking to an infrastructure partner that has the ability to provide these extra pieces that can really support there, as well as talking directly with the utility to understand if there's going to be extra pieces that when you do this upgrade, that the utility is going to come in and say these are the costs associated with requiring more power. And so that's kind of like a balancing act where you are essentially weighing the benefits of producing your own power with the benefits of having a larger service from the utility. And then one downside of essentially going to the utility and asking for a much larger service and just relying on that is that you are now essentially saying, hey, all of the fuel that I am now providing to my customers is actually coming from a single source. It's coming from that utility, which means that if there is an outage, you don't have an ability to provide any more fuel to your customers. And that's kind of where the whole DERs, or distributed energy resources, and microgrids kind of comes into this, is that by producing your own power on site, you actually have the ability to utilize that power during an outage. And you can actually essentially create some sort of a type of hedge against the utility that during an outage, you actually have the ability to still produce some power. And the second piece of that is that, I would typically look at these sites as a whole, as opposed to separating out the EV charging within its own service. Okay. Because when it is a single service, you have the ability to serve all of the loads on site to essentially to provide a fully resilient site for the operations that you're doing there. And for a travel center, that's pretty important, because it's one thing to be able to provide electricity for vehicles, but it's also quite important to have that facility that's on site up and running as well. And combining those together allows the entire site to be fully resilient. And then the last two things, the last one being generally, like I would look at these as a way to partner with someone who's willing to take some of this risk off of you, because there's a lot of pieces here that are new to the market. They're things that aren't very established on how they're accomplished. And by working with someone like a charging network provider or an infrastructure solution provider, they can essentially take on more of that risk, so that you don't essentially end up at the end with a project that you don't really fully understand how to complete. And also, you can kind of push that back on someone else and say, hey, this is something you've done multiple times. Like, can you please help us through this process? And then, with all the incentives that are available, and it's something that I mentioned before, that really does help bring down this upfront cost, and it really helps to get over that lever, or get over that hill of profitability, and really getting over getting over that hill of essentially saying, how much do I need to use these assets to be able to get to the point that it starts making financial sense for me?
All right. So can we talk about site specificity, and regionality considerations, and capacity decisions? What constraints should listeners know about?
So the biggest one is going to be working with that local utility. So one of the downsides of this EV transition is that what we are asking to do is essentially move a lot of the energy consuming parts of our economy to the edges of our utility. So typically a lot of these, a lot of manufacturing sites and a lot of fuel production sites, they're all very close to power plants. And so what happens is you have a very much a direct correlation of high power with high consumption, or high generation and high consumption. What we are doing now with EVs is we're actually saying we're going to move a lot of that energy further down into the distribution system. And what you're going to see, and we see this already, is that the distribution system for most urban areas right now is heavily taxed, and to the point that many times you're going to go ask for an upgrade, and there's going to be a long time associated with that upgrade for the utility to complete it, as well as in some cases there's a high cost associated with it. And the reason why is because if you think about it, you're essentially asking for much more power at the end of the line as opposed to closer to the generating source. And that's kind of where the distributed energy resources, that's where that comes in, is you're essentially adding more generation capacity at the end of the grid's utility instead of at the generation side of it. And then additionally, the other part of this is moving quickly, because a lot of companies are coming out now and they're making a lot of moves that seem like it might be overly aggressive on, building out these things and acquiring land and getting things before the demand may not be there. And the reason why I think that a lot of those groups are doing that is because it's essentially a land grab for capacity on the grid. And so what they're doing is they're analyzing the utility grid and saying, hey, these locations over here, there's a lot of distribution capacity. And so what we're going to do is actually put one of our sites there, because it's going to be much easier for us to get power to that site as opposed to our legacy site that's over here that actually doesn't have that much capacity. And so by having the conversation with the utility up front and really analyzing your options, like that's the ability for an industry like the truck stop industry to really plan out and figure out how this is going to work for them. And it's going to be different for each individual truck stop.
Okay. One more question, then I can hear about you guys. What about location recommendations?
Yeah, and this is the one topic that, as I mentioned before, it's not exactly something that I really spend a lot of my time on, but I do see a lot of correlations between this and what we get to work on a lot on, which is essentially the depot style charging, which is the captured demand. And what I would suggest on the location side is that as a public truck stop, or as a truck stop that is essentially opening up and looking for demand as people come in, as opposed to captured demand, you want to try to figure out ways that you can actually capture that demand. So ways that you can essentially talk to the fleets that you already serve in ways that you can say, hey, we'll create things like fuel cards and fuel programs that allow people to prepay or allow people to join the membership essentially of utilizing your assets. And what it does is it starts reducing more and more of that risk of putting that asset out to the public and opening it up to the public, because you know that at least some percentage of it is going to get utilized because you have a certain membership group that's willing to join that. And I think things like trying to get captured demand, as well as co-locating with things that are great amenities, are going to become more and more relevant. Because one of the things that I haven't really noted or mentioned yet is that to me, as chargers become more and more ubiquitous and more available, you're actually going to lose more and more of the value of just having the charger. So what happens is the first movers have the value of having the charger. Mm-hmm. And then over time, the more and more of the value is associated to what else is there or why else I would go there.
Okay.
And so that's the other part of it, is that there has to be a two-part plan to this, because as more and more charging infrastructure shows up, you're going to have other reasons for customers to come visit.
Okay. Before I let you go, can you tell us about your company, about Scale Microgrids?
Yeah, definitely. So Scale Microgrids started about 6 or 7 years ago up in New Jersey from a couple executives that were working essentially in more in the CHP side of the business, and they had the idea that essentially if you come in and you design these, what CHP systems are essentially a very similar to what we do on the microgrid side, but just simply with one asset or parallel assets. And what they essentially said was, if you add solar and battery storage to that mix, you actually end up having a much more robust opportunity to build a microgrid there. And so that idea is essentially what spawned Scale Microgrids as an ability to build a better, more accessible microgrid. Mm-hmm. And then as that technology kept moving, we actually added our financing arm, which essentially allows us to be now completely vertically integrated, where we are able to provide our microgrids actually as a service and at zero cost down. We can provide these highly complex systems and own and operate for our customers, so that from the customer's perspective, we're providing the services that come as a result of that microgrid, but not necessarily the complications of owning and operating and maintaining that microgrid over a long term.
Okay. How do people get a hold of you if they're interested in working with Scale Microgrids?
So, probably the easiest way is hopping on our website and going directly to the contact form. But me personally, I'm on LinkedIn a lot, and that's probably the way that I look and see everything that's going on in the market. Okay. And feel free to hop on there and follow me as well. But, directly to Scale on the website is probably the best way, and those get looked at real quickly. And so we'll definitely get back.
Okay. I'll be sure to link those when I post the podcast too. Okay. Before I let you go, I'm going to ask you my fun questions. Do you have 30 seconds? Okay.
Yeah,
so these are my fun questions. Do you prefer to ride or drive if you're on a road trip?
I prefer to drive. I don't think I'm a control freak, but I do get more nervous when I'm in a passenger seat as opposed to driving. So I do tend to drive a lot more. Okay.
And what's your go-to on the road snack?
I honestly always try to avoid eating as much as possible, because I will just keep eating the entire trip. But I think my most commonly bought thing is the Cool Ranch Doritos, because I never really get to have those that much, and then all of a sudden that's usually what I'm getting when I'm at the store.
Okay, I mean that's good. You gotta have something that you occasionally get. How do you take your truck stop coffee?
Definitely just black, or just with a little bit of cream, but just pretty standard cup of joe with just a little bit of cream in there.
Okay, and my last one is, if you're stuck at a truck stop in a snowstorm, how would you pass the time?
For me, in my current capacity, it'd probably be charging my vehicle. But other than that, I'm usually finding myself reading and passing the time and trying to learn as much as I can about trying to make this whole transition a little bit easier for everybody.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and thanks for listening to today's episode of The Truck Stops Here. You can find us online at natso.com/podcast. If you have any questions, if you'd like to be on the podcast, reach out to me at editor@natso.com. All right, thanks again, Tim.
The Truck Stops Here was brought to you by NATSO, the association representing truck stops and travel centers. Visit natso.com for more information. The Truck Stops Here is produced by NATSO in collaboration with Human Factor. Producers are Amy Toner and Darren Schulte.